I'm your host, Saladin Allah. Today's episode, I wanted to build about the personal title Queen. And what inspired me to do this program is I get a lot of correspondences from people around the world asking me various different questions about not only 5%er culture, but also just the science of everything in life. And more recently, men have been asking me about queens, and women have also been asking me about queens. And just in my experience over the last decade, I've started to see the term queen become a lot more commonly used throughout social media in regards to how men refer to women and how women refer to themselves. But when I sit and I assess the actions that follow that personal title, a lot of times I saw that there was a contradiction there or a lack of true depth understanding what that personal title, that role, and that responsibility of a queen actually is. Some years back, I put up a build on my YouTube channel. If you wanted to check it out, just go to YouTube and put in Atlantis build and put in Queen, Queen, and Quean. And I explained a little bit more about some of those things that I'll begin to see throughout social media in regards to people using that personal title and not having a true understanding of what that actually required. And I wanted to take this time to go a little bit deeper and explain a little further why 5%ers have utilized that term queen, not only in our supreme alphabet, but what it actually means when we refer to women as such, and why women take on that personal title themselves. Number one, I think it's important to keep in mind that we are a nation within a nation. We live within a Western society that has an entirely different perspective on a lot of things, whether it's family, whether it's community, whether it's economy. There are various different perspectives that we have that the larger society does not embrace. And one of the main perspectives we have that the dominant society does not embrace or advocate is our view of women and the role and the title and the responsibility that women play within our lives and in our families and communities. When you look at the larger society, one of the things that you see that is a part of the status quo is sexism. And sexism is basically the discrimination against women based upon gender. And there are many different statistics that you can strive to research that reinforce the fact that women have always traditionally been discriminated against, not only here in America, but in any European society. If you go back and study any of the Victorian era, one thing that you see is a woman's only aspiration was to be married to a man. There weren't a lot of different opportunities for a woman to be self-actualized in a sense where she had an actual career. Those women who did take that less traveled road have been historically ostracized. They've been sometimes burnt at the stake in terms of being defined as a witch. You've had women who were disenfranchised because of it. There were a lot of different things going on in Europe, and not only in that Victorian era, but throughout European society, where men never had a healthy respect, generally speaking, for women. If you take it further back to Roman society, because European society is not only an amalgamation of various different cultural contributions from the Vikings and the Britons and the Germanic tribes and Rome and Greece. If you take it further back, you see Roman society. If you study Roman society, you see the same exact thing. The only aspiration for women was to be married to a man. They didn't have a lot of opportunities to be self actualized and to have a career or anything like that. And the same women who took that less traveled road were also persecuted, were also ostracized, and oftentimes crucified for it. Take it further back to Greek society, which is considered the hallmark of Western civilization. You see the same exact power dynamic in place. Women had only an aspiration to be married. Any woman that wanted to be self actualized and to have a career was ostracized. She was demonized. This was a long standing status quo in terms of male and female relations that you still see in full effect today here in America, because America is considered the new world. America is a child of Europe, and Europe is a child of Germanic tribes and Britons and Viking culture and Roman culture and Greek culture. This status quo is something that you will see that runs concurrently from Greek society all the way up to American society. It's sexist, it's misogynistic, and it is chauvinistic. Those of you who haven't really studied that in depth, I encourage you to go back and to study the male-female dynamic or relationships, whether it was in Greek society, whether it was in Viking society, Rome. Study that, and it gives you a better insight into that sexism, that chauvinism, and that misogyny. And it also gives you greater insight into the type of status quo that we find ourselves within here in America. I think it was important to elaborate on that first and foremost because it lays the proper foundation for why we define women with the personal title that does not reinforce and uphold that status quo. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, when you consider the English language and personal titles, nowadays here in America, you don't have the same type of personal titles that you would see in the old world or in Europe. In Europe, you would see personal titles like dukes and duchess and lords and various different titles such as that. But here in America, you only have primarily a few basic personal titles that males and females or men and women use. Men only have one basic personal title, and that is Mr. M.R. period. Women, on the other hand, have about 4 different personal titles that they use here in America. And that is Miss, M-I-S-S, Mrs., M-R-S period, Miss, M-S period, and then also ma'am, M-A-A-M. Why? Why would a man only have one personal title, but women are expected to use a variation of 4 different personal titles? I think when you consider it, it gives you greater insight into the sexism, chauvinism, and misogyny that I was talking about that runs concurrently from Greek society all the way to American society today. First of all, when you look at a man's personal title as Mr., that tells you nothing about his marital status. A man is still a Mr. whether he's married or not. What it implies is his dynamic or position of power never changes based upon his marital status. So a man is Mr. Smith whether he's married or not, and it gives you no indication of his marital status. A woman, on the other hand, she's considered a Miss, M-I-S-S, or a young unwed woman up into the point that she gets married and takes on the title of Mrs., M-R-S. So when a woman is born, she has the personal title Miss, which implies her proximity to a man or the aspiration to one day be married. Men are not born with that same expectation or aspiration to be joined with a woman. Women are. That's why she's given the personal title Miss. So a woman is born into this world carrying that burden or that responsibility to aspire to be married simply because she is going to be addressed under the personal title Miss. Once she does get married, now she assumes another personal title, which is Mrs. MRS, period. Mrs. also tells you about her proximity to a man. And that dynamic of power in regards to a man never changes. He's always going to be a mister, whether he's married or not. A woman is not always going to be a miss. A miss is based upon her aspiration to become a Mrs. one day. Once she becomes a Mrs., now that personal title reflects her marital status. When you look at the personal title Miss, MS, period, that is only used for a woman who does not want to disclose her marital status because it doesn't tell you whether she's a Miss or a Mrs. Yet at the same time, if you're communicating with a woman and you are not sure about her marital status, the safest personal title to use is Miss, MS, period. When you look at ma'am, MAAM, that title is primarily used for a woman of an older age whom you also don't know what her marital status is. And you use ma'am out of respect for a woman who is older than you and you're not sure about her marital status. Well, one of the things that you see that's consistent with all of these personal titles for a woman is that all of them are based upon her relationship to a man, her investment in a relationship to a man, and her status, her role, and her responsibility to a man. That says nothing about a man's role, his responsibility, and his relationship to a woman. Again, a man can be a mister whether he's married or not. That tells you nothing about his marital status. And I think on a psychological level, that also defines the power dynamics that you oftentimes see within relationships between men and women. If you go back to European society, you get a very good illustration of it in terms of the way relationships were carried out. For example, when you have a woman who's a miss, and another thing that I wanted to mention is Miss, MISS, is also used as a personal title for women in the service field. So for example, if you go to a bank and you are talking to one of the bank tellers, you may say, Miss Smith, can you do this, that, and the third? Or if you are at a grocery store and you're striving to get a woman's attention who's a cashier, you use the personal title Miss in that capacity. Of course, if you don't know that woman's marital status. Now, going back to what I was saying about European society, when you saw a woman who married into the aristocracy, or she became a duchess, for example, and married a duke, that duke, as a mister, only had certain requirements or responsibilities in relationship to the woman that married him. He didn't marry her. Even if that woman had more wealth, more power, more political clout, and owned more land, that man or that mister that married her, oftentimes his sole intent was to take ownership of that wealth, to utilize a political clout that she had, and to take ownership of that land, because that became his personal inheritance. Because once she gave birth to an heir, that would be the extension of his personal legacy. And when you study European society, you see things like that happening all the time. Either a man would marry a woman that had wealth and political clout and land ownership, and he would strive to wrestle away that wealth and that land and that political clout from her in some type of way. Either that was to get her declared insane or incapacitated, or to get her murdered, or to do a lot of various different things in order to take what she actually had. That was very, very common, not only in European society, but you see the exact same mentality being expressed here in America, because the same status quo of sexism, misogyny, and chauvinism still exists. Going back to what I said about the personal titles, during European society, when a woman was betrothed to a man or she married a man, he still did whatever the hell he wanted to do. And that's one thing that you will see when you go back and study some of this history and these period pieces. She was expected to remain faithful and chaste and loyal to him, but he could do whatever he wanted to do. Her sole responsibility was just to produce an heir. Other than that, there was no real relationship amongst males and females in those type of societies, and that is why you begin to see the popularization of romance novels. You go back during the Victorian era, romance novels was popping because a lot of women never had the opportunity to experience true love or to feel as though the man in their life was a hero, not a tyrant. So the only time a woman had an opportunity to experience a world like that was through a romance novel. And at the same time, you look at other books like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that gives you more insight into the monsters that a lot of these women had to actually deal with on a daily basis that still exist today here in American society. Considering that, and I also encourage those of you that have not really looked into any of the things that I'm talking about, whether it was the time of the Victorian era or it was the time where you had the witch hunts going on in Europe and over here in America with the Salem witch trials. I don't care what period you look at. Just go look at the period and see the male and female dynamic and the relationships between men and women. And it gives you a greater insight into some of the things that I'm talking about. Now, in our society as 5%ers, we don't use the personal titles Mrs. and Miss and Ma'am and Miss. We don't use those personal titles in regards to the relationship of man and woman. We use the personal title Queen, and I'm going to explain why. Just like I explained earlier, where you have the title Mr., which does not change or tells you nothing about his marital status or his investment or relationship to a woman, and you look at the 4 primary personal titles that a woman in this society uses that tells you everything about her investment or relationship and proximity to a man, we use the personal title Queen because it does not reflect that level of inequality. A queen in our supreme alphabet is knowledge God. That's the 17th letter. When you look at 1 and 7 or knowledge God, it tells you that a queen is one who is aware of her infinite potential. In order for her to be aware or conscious of her infinite potential, she understands the importance of equality. Because when you look at knowledge God, the link between knowledge and God or being aware of your infinite potential is your sense of equality or your sense of fairness, your sense of balance or homeostasis. That is one of the things that keeps a woman who sees herself as a queen truly grounded in her identity. When you look at a queen, that also does not tell you or imply her proximity or marital status in relationship to a man or a king. A queen is still going to be a queen regardless if a king is present. That title is not the same as Miss, MISS, or MRS, because those other titles, like I said, only implies her proximity and relationship and investment in a man. A queen is a queen regardless if you have a king in the court or not. And that is one of the reasons why we use that personal title, because we understand in terms of true balance of a relationship and fairness, a woman must be a woman, self-defined and self-actualized, not based upon her proximity or relationship to us, but she must be whole within herself before she has and establishes that relationship with us. The epitome of that, of a woman operating within that capacity and having that sense of self-realization, is a queen, Queen. One of the bills that I put up on my YouTube channel, I elaborated on the difference between a queen, Queen, and a queen, Quean. Now, a quean, that type of queen, is a woman who does not have that sense of self-realization. She is a complete opposite. That is a woman nowadays who would be considered a thought, Thot, or that hoe over there. Not to say that she is, but that is to say when a woman does not have that sense of self-realization, that is the way in which she operates, because the link between knowledge and God is equality. That is six. Six in English, when you take it over into Greek, it is hex, Hex. When you take it over into Latin, it is sex, Sex. So the same woman that is not self-realized or does not truly value herself as whole oftentimes utilizes sex, which becomes a hex, and is the primary factor of which she defines her identity. She doesn't really see the transition of becoming aware of her own infinite potential, but she just stays rooted in her own sexuality, and that is the way that she attends this world, and that she sets up the dynamic in terms of her power relation with a man. Now let me explain this. Because queen in our supreme alphabet is knowledge God, that is not the type of dynamic you see in Western society that reflects a Mr., Mrs., Miss, ma'am relationship. What I mean is, some brothers have this mentality that in order for a woman to be who she is, she got knowledge God. She got to know who I am. And they take on the same exact attitude and posture that an 18th century Caucasian in Europe would take on when a duchess came into a court and married a duke. He just has expectations of what she needs to know in relationship to him. It's about you knowing me. You got to be down with me, as opposed to him being also down with her and manifesting a level of true equality. Does that make sense? Here, let me explain it a little further. There are some brothers who are 5%, and some of us have this attitude that a queen is one that acknowledges God, right? That tells you nothing about his relationship to her or what he is invested in. That is no different than saying I'm a mister, and it tells you nothing about his marital status, but yet you look at the woman and she's either a miss, a Mrs., a miss, or a ma'am, meaning she is the one that is in proximity to him, and she has to consider the way in which she has to invest in that relationship, but it tells you nothing about his own investment. That is the same type of mentality and posture that you see in European society, where you have all of these expectations for women, but you don't see the same emphasis in regards to what a man must do to reciprocate that investment with a woman. So when I talk about knowledge God, or a woman being aware of her own infinite potential and her true sense of equality with a man, that is a growth and development process that a woman must take on her own. It doesn't mean that we as men don't have the ability to encourage or to inspire and empower and educate a woman. We primarily do that with our daughters. And that's one of the things that I also wanted to elaborate on. I have two queens, my two daughters, and I've played that role with them as they've grown and developed. Yet at one point in their growth and development, that parent-child dynamic of power changed, where now we deal with each other on a level of equality as adult to adult. I acknowledge that. That is something that I've been conscious of. But yet we oftentimes don't see many of us as conscious of that shift in power in terms of dynamics, which means we're not as invested in equality as we should be invested. So a woman, in being a queen, not a quean, but a queen, begins to define herself as whole. So when we address a woman as a queen and she addresses herself as a queen, her identity and that personal title does not hinge upon her proximity to us. The same way in Western society where a man has the personal title Mr., and that does not change his dynamic of power whether he is married or not, Queen functions the exact same way in our society. A woman is a queen regardless if she has a king or not. That does not shift or change her dynamic of power. To take it a little further, our knowledge God degree, or our 17th degree in our 1 to 40s, asks us the question, what is the meaning of civilization? And the answer is one having knowledge, wisdom, understanding, culture, refinement, and is not a savage in the pursuit of happiness. Now, what does this have to do with what I'm just talking about? Well, if you listen to the answer of that degree and the question, it is non-gender specific, which means it also applies to a man and a woman. And that is the true meaning of civilization. One having knowledge, not a man having knowledge, not just a woman having knowledge, but one having knowledge, wisdom, understanding, culture, refinement, and is not a savage in the pursuit of happiness. So that is something that is expected equally of a man and a woman. Now, when you study Western society, whether it was Greece, Rome, Europe, you see a very different expectation in terms of civilization. You don't see it being gender neutral. You see women being expected to uphold a level of civilization and refinement and decorum and social grace publicly and privately, while the men can be as grimy as they want to be. And that's the same type of mentality and posture you see today in America. Males can sleep with as many women as they want to and be looked at as a hero. But if a woman were to sleep with more than one man, she's considered a hoe. What I'm pointing out is a double standard. You have one set of rules for women, and then you have another set of rules for women. Where women are expected to function within the parameters of a male's mentality, why they don't have to hold themselves accountable to the same standard and measurement they're using to judge her by. That is one of the purposes that the personal title queen serves for civilization. And regardless if we are a male or female or man and woman, the expectation of being civilized is equal. I'm not expected to be more civilized than a woman is, and she's not expected to be more civilized than I am. That is a gender neutral expectation. Another thing I need to mention is the personal title queen is not given to a grown woman by a grown man, because then it changes from an adult to adult power dynamic to a parent-child dynamic. The only queens that I've made are my own daughters. I gave them that title when they were born. But as they've grown and developed, I had to redefine that power dynamic and respectfully deal with them adult to adult. Some brothers are out here talking about they've made a grown woman a queen. No, you did not make a grown woman anything. The only thing that you can do is acknowledge who she is based upon her acknowledging her own identity. And that does not necessarily include her proximity to you. As a queen, she can choose to have a relationship with us. That does not change her dynamic of power. And that is ultimately what allows us to maintain the proper balance in terms of advocating civilization and also not being savages in the pursuit of happiness, because the standard of expectation is the same regardless of our gender. When we choose to have a relationship with one another in the interest of building a family unit and being a part of a community and a society that advocates civilization, we have an equal voice that we bring to that relationship. It's not that the man is telling her what to do or that she's telling him what to do. I think a great piece that you can analyze that gives you insight into that unequal power dynamic between men and women is the series called Mad Men, because it chronicles not only the advertisement and the media expression of that mentality, but it gives you a great social study of the 1950s when women begin to just start entering the workforce. Before that, women just generally stayed at home and took care of children and ironed clothes and had a man's newspaper waiting for him when he came home from work. And they give you the illustration of how those family dynamics functioned as well as the precursor to the bra burning era, where women became so dissatisfied with that power dynamic that they rebelled, and you had a feminist sentiment brewing within American society. To speak a little bit more on that, the type of misogyny and chauvinism and sexism that we've seen in Western society throughout its history, you've had women who have internalized that so much that they've inverted it into misandry. And misandry is basically the hatred of men. So you have a lot of women who are advocating that particular cause as well as a feminist movement, not in the interest of reconciling the relationships between males and females either. So whether you are advocating misogyny or misandry, both of you are not advocating for the right common cause in terms of propagating civilization, because it shows that you are not truly invested in having the knowledge, wisdom, understanding, culture, and sense of refinement that is necessary to not be that savage in your pursuit of personal happiness. This was inspiring, empowering, and educating, and gave those of you a little bit more insight into what the Queen's Code is truly about. A woman being conscious and aware of her own infinite potential. And in her recognizing her infinite potential, she comes to a state of being whole, or understanding what true equality and balance is in terms of not only what she should expect in all fairness from herself, but what she should also expect from a man who recognizes who he is in terms of his knowledge of God. That is why it's so important for women to have support groups for and by other women, because there are certain aspects of knowledge, wisdom, understanding, culture, refinement, and not being a savage in the pursuit of happiness that a woman can communicate to another woman because they share the same common interests in terms of that identity. There are some things that a man can tell another woman. For example, with my own daughters, there's things that I could teach them and I've taught them, but as they've evolved and become women themselves, the greatest conversation that they can have in terms of the specificity of what they deal with as a female is a conversation not only adult to adult, but woman to woman. So that is something that is also very, very important. Women need each other. They need another woman who understands what it means to be a queen, to share with them the insights and the encouragement of what they also need to do to be able to express and live out that identity. That is truly what helps us bring the type of homeostasis and balance and function we should have in our families to make sure we produce the proper communities and control those communities in terms of national consciousness and peace.
Hey, 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 I wasn't the one.